안녕하십니까?
Hello, everyone.
2-1 세션 사회를 맡은 김명기입니다.
I am Myung-gi Kim, moderator of Session 2-1. It's a pleasure to meet all of you.
오늘 2021 한반도 국제 평화 포럼이 개막이 되고
Today is the opening day of the 2021 KGFP, and I think that it is very meaningful that the Unification Council of Korea is participating in the conference. And the title of this session, 2-1, is Evaluation and Meaning of the 30th Anniversary of the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement. As you are well aware, the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement was signed by the two prime ministers of North and South. Although it was not fully implemented, the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement left a meaningful footprint in the history of the North and South. We will be discussing the background and how we came to the agreement, and actually that was quite dramatic. And the content of the basic agreement states that the North and South will be identifying various ways in order to progress toward reunification. And although it's been 30 years since the signing of the basic agreement, still it is an important agreement for inter-Korean relations. And the original name of the basic agreement is very long, about reconciliation and exchanges. And because of the long name, we are just calling it the basic agreement. And it was not just a one-off agreement. It was an agreement of 9 areas, and also it talks about the various steps in order to realize unification. So it has a very comprehensive framework. And there were 3 appendix agreements, and there were 3 subcommittees according to this agreement, and there was the 4 committees and the Red Cross, and there was also a liaison office. And when the co-committee is operated, there is the legal deliberation committee and criticism mediation committee. So there were various sub-level committees that were on the working level that would be supporting the agreement on reconciliation, non-aggression exchanges, and cooperation between North and South. Regarding the nuclear issue, it started with the Denuclearization Treaty. So for us, in order to realize the North and South Union, this basic agreement made all preparations possible. And the basic agreement, however, was not implemented. However, the content of the basic agreement and its spirit still remains despite being signed 30 years ago. And the following agreements and measures taken for inter-Korean relations was under the basic agreement. 1 generation has passed since the basic agreement, but still the North and South is still in a stalemate situation and cannot trust one another. So it is quite frustrating that we are still in such a stalemate. So the North and South should return to its original spirit and mindset when we signed the basic agreement. In our session, we will be reviewing the significance and meaning of the basic agreement and try to draw lessons from it. Also, through the basic agreement, we would like to find ways to overcome the stalemate in the relations and try to find a driving force to progress toward more peace and building up of trust. And we hope to pool wisdom among the presenters and discussants through this session. And first, I would like to introduce the speakers and the discussants. So we will be hearing, first of all, from Professor of Halla University, Kwang-ho Park. He's going to be presenting on Inter-Korean Basic Agreement implications for today, marking the 30th anniversary of signing. And next, Korea Hana Foundation Director Pyeongchang Lim will be presenting on implications of Inter-Korean Basic Agreement and our work toward peaceful unification. And we have three discussants. First, Unification Council of Korea, Jong Yeol-yu. And we have Ung-hee Kim, who is the president of the Association for Supporting Inter-Korean Exchange and Cooperation, and Moo Il-lee, Kaesong Industrial District Foundation Standing Auditor. As you know, while working at the Ministry of Unification, he has contributed greatly in improving inter-Korean relations, and all of our presenters and discussants participated in various activities to enhance inter-Korean relations. And for the presenters, I will give them each 15 minutes, and for the discussants, 5 minutes each. And following the discussants' remarks, we will have a Q&A and a panel discussion for 10 to 20 minutes. The audience who are participating both online and offline can ask their questions. Those here at the venue may use the QR code that they have received to go onto the online page. And those who are watching via YouTube, you can utilize the link provided in the explanation portion to post your questions. We will first hear from Professor Kwang-ho Park.
So the topic of my presentation is Inter-Korean Basic Agreement, its implications, given that this year marks the 30-year anniversary of the Basic Agreement. So we have people here in person and the audience who have joined virtually. And I'm sure that you all remember the times when everybody was present here in person. And since we have many experts with us today, I am quite careful in analyzing and assessing the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement, but I will do my best to provide my view on the Basic Agreement. So I think that the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement was a milestone towards unification, and it still is a milestone towards unification. So there is no other agreement that points to one very distinct destination. But it is a shame that we were not able to follow the path that was laid out by the agreement. So this is the agreement that was signed back then. And this is a busy slide, so you might not be able to read the details. But if you look at the right bottom, you can see that the Prime Minister back then, Won-sik, and Premier Won Hyung-mook were the two representatives that signed this agreement in 1991. So this is a key agreement, but it's not that long. It doesn't contain many articles. I have the original here. And it was an 8-page agreement that was signed between the two leaders. So here, it consists of 4 sections and a preamble. So the preamble contains very important ideas about what the agreement aims to achieve. And this is the preamble, which says recognize that the relationship between the two sides is not a relationship between countries, but a special relationship that is provisionally formed in the process of pursuing reunification. And I believe that the wording here well represents and illustrates the spirit for reunification. I think it really clearly defines the essence of the inter-Korean relations and the way forward. So the first section is about reconciliation. So recognize and respect each other's system and transform the current state of armistice into a solid state of peace between the two sides and abide by the military armistice agreement. Section 2 is non-aggression. It talks about non-use of armed force, resolve disputes through dialogue and negotiation. And the borderline is the military demarcation line under the armistice agreement and a zone that falls under the jurisdiction of both sides. So it gives a clear definition of a DMZ and the demarcation line. And Section 3 lays out details about exchanges and cooperation. And we are still faithful to the provisions of exchanges and cooperation. So here we have 3 chapters or sections under the basic agreement. And I'm sure that you all agree with me in that this basic agreement is a milestone agreement. So now, this was adopted at the 5th high-level inter-Korean talks back in December 13th, 1991, as introduced by the moderator. I remember it was Intercontinental Hotel where the leaders met. And I was served this dish called 불도장. Anyways, and then this went into effect in 1992, February. And it was the first agreement ever signed by the Prime Minister of Korea and Premier of North Korea. And the two sides went through different process for approval. So in North Korea, the Premier reported it at the plenary session of the 6th Central Committee of WPK, and this was approved at the joint meeting of the Central People's Committee and the permanent meeting of the Supreme People's Assembly, and Chairman Kim ratified the agreement. So I actually have some details here because I thought I had 20 minutes for my presentation. But anyways, this is a short video clip that shows the moment the agreement was signed.
1991년 12월 13일 오전 10시 20분
December 13th, 1991, the Prime Minister of South Korea and Premier of North Korea signed the agreement.
그만큼 한 번 서명을 하는데 10여 초의 시간이 걸렸습니다.
It took about 10 seconds to sign the agreement.
역사적인 사인이요.
This is a very historic signing.
정리하고 저하고 이 소위 속되게 표현하면 궁합이 잘 맞아서.
I think we hit off well here.
남북 총리의 서명은 남과 북으로 표기된 합의서와 북과 남으로
So this
표기된
led
합의서와
to 2 copies of agreement for each side, so 4 copies in total.
그리고 남과 북이 두 부씩
And
나눠 가집니다.
each side will have and keep 2 copies each.
남과 북이 갈린 지 46년. 대화가 오간
So
뒤
it's been 46 years since the 2 countries divided, and it's been 1 year and 3 months since the 2 prime ministers sat together at the negotiation table. So you just saw a video clip of the moment the agreement was signed. And we still have the copy here, but the Prime Minister of Korea back then and the Premier of North Korea back then now passed away, so that's a shame. Anyways, I would like to briefly talk about the response from both North and South with respect to the adoption of the agreement. So this is what President Roh Tae-woo said. The South and the North must seek reconciliation, cooperation, and non-aggression based on trust. And Chairman Kim Il-sung said, the adoption of the agreement is a great victory achieved in the process of the whole nation's struggle to implement the 3 principles of national reunification and is a historic event. So it was very well received by the 2 sides. And during an interview at Kumsusan capital, Chairman Kim also said that this was a very important agreement and something that our people will be delighted with. Now, we also need to examine the joint declaration of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula to understand the larger context. So this was signed back in January 20th, 1992 and entered into force in February 19th, 1992. So these 2 agreements are like twin agreements that we have to examine together. If you look at the details of the joint declaration, it talks about one of the key elements. The South and the North shall not test, manufacture, produce, receive, possess, store, deploy, or use nuclear weapons. The South and North shall use nuclear energy solely for peaceful purposes, and the 2 sides shall not possess nuclear reprocessing and uranium enrichment facilities. So I read this morning that Pyeongchang restarted its Yongbyon facilities, so that's a shame. But anyways, so this was what was laid out in the joint declaration. And had the 2 countries followed this, we would not be struggling with North Korea's nuclear issues. And I'm sure that we would have been on the journey to reunification. Now let me briefly talk about the background of the adoption and implementation. And what mattered the most, I think, was the necessity of North Korea. At the time, there was a national rage over what was happening, and President Roh Tae-woo was pursuing a friendly North Korea policy, so that set the right condition for this agreement. At the same time, North Korea actually got the impression that it had to change. And I believe that drove the success of the agreement. We'll skip this part, the background of the adoption of the agreement. So anyways, this was the background. And this is the process of the adoption. So before this, what Bush pursued was to withdraw all the nuclear weapons from Korea, and Chairman Kim said that the regime did not possess any nuclear weapons. So it was based on those 2 statements that this agreement was incepted. And as I said, this is a twin agreement. Then let us look at the implementation phase. Back in 1992, on October 27th, the government, political parties, associations wanted the intergovernmental talks to be discontinued because during the Korea-US Defense Ministers meeting, the ministers decided to resume the team spirit joint exercise. So that is why the North Korean regime expressed its willingness to discontinue the talks. And then the North said that it will not attend the joint committee. That led to the declaration of no intention of resuming dialogue back in 1993. And that's when the agreement reached a stalemate. Then what are the implications for us in 2021? We have to travel back to 2018 because this kind of gives us a déjà vu. So actually, up to December 2017, North Korea was quite hostile to South Korea. However, during his New Year's speech in 2018, Chairman Kim Jong-un said that North Korea was willing to participate in the Winter Olympic Games by saying that as for the Winter Olympic Games to be held soon in South Korea, it will serve as a good occasion for demonstrating our nation's prestige, and we earnestly wish the Olympic Games a success. And then this statement led to 4 series of events. So on the top left, that's 1, 2. Excuse me, that's 1. So top 2 images is 1, 2, bottom 2, 3, 4. Then do you know the chronological order of the photos? Can you do so? So number 1 is participation in the Pyeongchang Olympics. Then our special team visited North Korea, and the photo on the top right is September 19th in Pyeongyang for the Panmunjom Declaration. And bottom right is the June 12th Singapore Summit. So, as Chairman Kim expressed his intention to dispatch the North Korean athletes to Pyeongchang, then South Korea sent a special envoy team to North Korea, which led to Inter-Korean Summit, which led to the Singapore Summit. So it was Inter-Korean Summit first, which led to the success of the Singapore Summit. However, unfortunately, this is June of last year. This is when North Korea blew up a joint liaison office with the South. And as I said, this is a déjà vu. And this actually came to an end with the collapse of the Hanoi Summit in February 28, 2019. So the sanctions on North Korea trumps military pressure, and at the same time, Moon Jae-in's attitude towards North Korea caused the change of North Korea's stance. I think it was a mix of these 3 elements, but I will skip the details for now. Then what can we learn from this experience? what does the North Korean regime want or need? This is the basic agreement booklet. It's about 700 pages long. And how many provisions are we faithful to? So far, we haven't had any dialogues or exchanges with North Korea. Then what is the implication of this inter-Korean basic agreement? Which of the provisions between the two Koreas are kept? Well, armistice, we are keeping that. Then what other than that? What next? And this 700-page long agreement was developed, but if one side is only faithful to the agreement, then it's pointless. So I believe that the economic activities and transactions cooperation between the two Koreas was the most long-lived, as it was required and needed by the two sides. Then what can be done to ensure the implementation of the agreement? The international community should guarantee the implementation of the agreement, or other necessary actions should be made to keep this alive, because otherwise it will be short-lived. Next, given the current circumstances, given that we are facing an absence of an agreement, what areas can drive inter-Korean relations? Of course, I'm sure that some ideas are crossing your mind, but I will not elaborate on that. I think it's mostly humanitarian aid that we should focus on. So, of course, creating a fancy agreement is important, but really following such agreement and abiding by such agreement is the critical part. And it's a lesson that we need to learn from the past agreement. With that, I would like to wrap up. Thank you very much. Yes, you used 5 more minutes. So, yes, you talked about the inter-Korean basic agreement as well as the denuclearization agreement, the two twin agreements that we need to follow and that will set the milestone towards unification. You talked about the effects and implications of the agreement and significance of the agreement So you said that we need to come up with some measures that can guarantee the implementation of the agreement. And maybe you can give us some details about such measures. Since we are pressed for time, we would like to move on to the next speaker, Mr. Im Byung-chul.
First of all, I would like to say that it is a pleasure to be participating in 2021 KGFP. And I started my official work in 1991 at the Ministry of Unification. And the moderator and other speakers were there during the preparation and signing of the basic agreement. And I wasn't there, not there myself. However, I think my 30 years in office is aligned with the spirit of the basic agreement. And so I would like to give my presentation based on my 30 years of experience in official life. First of all, what is the meaning of the basic agreement? I believe that the basic agreement shows the essence and the core of our North Korean policy on reconciliation and cooperation and pursuance of peaceful unification. And provisions that South Korea felt was important for unification was followed and agreed by North Korea, and I think that it is a very important milestone. Next, on the background of the basic agreement, it was explained by the other presenter that it was the very first time that the two sides officially recognized one another officially, and that is why the name of the two countries were stated. And the one Joseon was something that South Korea could not follow, and South Korea felt that using the official country name of the two sides was important. And this was led by a conservative administration in Korea, which was the Notae administration, so there wasn't internal conflict, and it was an embracement policy. And on North Korean nuke issue, we adopted a parallel strategy of improving inter-Korean relations while addressing the North Korean nuke issue. And the North was confronted with a crisis of their regime, and so Korea's government, South Korea's government, gave a proposal that North Korea could adopt in order to overcome its internal difficulties. And so the basic agreement was adopted, and the significance of the agreement is that the two sides officially recognized one another, and the basic direction for peace and co-prosperity was put into writing. And it has the characteristics and the nature of a doctrine type of an agreement, and it brought an end to conflict and confrontation, and it also was a practical doctrine on opening up cooperation and reconciliation. The two high-level officials of North and South signed this agreement, and it stated that the current divided situation was temporary and transitional, that we have a special relation trying to pursue unification. And these are the main characteristics of the basic agreement. It talks about, in concrete, the stances and activities that the two sides must implement. And whether or not it was implemented, I believe that it brought about big changes. It became an important framework, and it was recognized as an important framework for the various agreements. And since the basic agreement, for the next 30 years, the basic agreement became the origin for various other agreements, such as the June 15 North-South Joint Declaration. And the June 15 Declaration was reconfirmed during the 2007 October 4th Declaration. And then the Panmun Declaration was signed on April 27th, was declared on April 27th in 2018. And the content of the Panmun Declaration is similar to the context and the content of the basic agreement. Then, how has the basic agreement been implemented thus far? The basic agreement was not implemented, and the high-level discussion and committee frameworks did not follow through. During the time that this should be implemented, there was the nuke issue, North Korean nuke issue, and this led to cooling down of relations with Washington and DPRK. So, going on to the details, the June 15 Declaration and Panmun Declaration, we had very meaningful declarations, but still the time of unification seems quite far off. And the fundamental reason that led to the current stalemate was because the basic agreement was not fully implemented. So the biggest stumbling block is the the chronic mutual distrust. So such meaningful agreements came about, but it was implemented and then it led to a stop. It was repeatedly implemented and stopped. Such repetitions led to distrust. Therefore, both sides need to re-establish trust. And this has to be implemented through actual action. There was a June 15 declaration, and part of it was implemented, which led to a reduction of tension and reduction of hostility toward one another. So there were times when measures were taken. Then, what was the critical issue that led to non-implementation? Of course, it was due to North Korea actions such as the spies that were sent by North Korea and the team spirit training, which led to the first nuke crisis, and we could not have a committee meeting, and there was changes in the government and it was not implemented properly. In addition to that, with the South Korean government being changed, the North Korean policy was changed, and there was a change in the strategy toward North Korea. Also, there were several cases where DPRK was in dispute and conflict with international society. In addition to that, the neighboring powers around the Korean Peninsula had conflicting interests with one another. So since the post-Cold War era, on the Korean Peninsula, we are living in a neo-Cold War era. And international society are not giving in, and it seems that we are living in a situation where the North and international society are not backing off, and this led to sanctions, and because of this, it is now more difficult to implement the basic agreement. So the very first nuclear issue, the North Korean nuclear issue, became a stumbling block and a hindrance to implementation. For the North, for them, they wanted to use their nuclear weapons as a link to normalize relations with the United States, and they want to strike a peace agreement. However, for the United States, they want to maintain their hegemony and eliminate any threats such as North Korean nuclear weapons that may become a threat to their dominance. And every time there were nuclear tests, there was increase and escalation in tensions. So the North Korean nuclear issue for the past 30 years had a big impact on the implementation of the basic agreement. During at the time of 1990s, there was asymmetric situation after the post-Cold War, and the North Korea, and due to this, North Korea and the United States were in big conflict, and the basic agreement cannot be implemented, and due to the North Korean nuclear issue, and it is souring relations with Washington, and we are seeing repetition of escalation of tension. So how can we then from now on implement the basic agreement? In the process, we need more exchange and cooperation, and we can go toward a union between DPRK and ROK. So we have to begin by reflecting on what went wrong. So this should be the starting point. The basic agreement was quite concrete, and it talked about what measures should be taken when there is conflict, when there is a problem between the North and South, then there were ways on how we can overcome it. And in implementing the basic agreement, it should contribute in the peace regime by leading to an end of war declaration and a reaching of the peace agreement. So the basic agreement can become the beginning of the end of war declaration. So there was the Panmun declaration, and following this, during the DPRK US summit, President Trump said that there can be an end of war declaration. However, this will lead to a reduction in the concerns by DPRK that the armistice agreement might be neutralized. In order to implement the basic agreement, we need to increase trust, and there should be consistency in our unification and North Korean policies, regardless of which government takes office. And there should also be international recognition of the Korean Peninsula peace regime based on the basic agreement. And we need some legal measures that are taken, and for this basic agreement to become a living document and not one that is just in the books, we should have some legal measures taken, and there should be legislation, and North Korea will have to pay for any for non-implementation. And we can give the agreement a effect of a treaties. And internally, I believe that we need to make the agreement legally binding. So in the process of striking an agreement and ratifying any agreement with the North, we need to include participation from the National Assembly and the people of Korea so that it can be legislated. And we need to have a strategy of making each of the items that have been agreed into agenda items. And we need to check North Korea's will to implement it to ensure the implementation. I think that it is impossible to have a unification based on force or on any unilateral measures. We need to have a peace regime. And unification is our ultimate goal to overcome the divided peninsula. The basic agreement can lay the foundation for the spirit of non-aggression. And in the process of implementing the basic agreement, if we increase exchange and cooperation, then this will lead to improved relations and prevent this becoming an international problem. So we need to have some creative measures that can bring North Korea back to the negotiation table, and we need to pool many ideas and the wisdom of many participants. And South Korea is the actor and player on the Korean Peninsula, so we need to take on a more active role as an intermediary between Washington and Pyongyang. And if we play this role, we can bring both sides together. For the Korean Peninsula, we should establish our position and role as an important actor. Thus far, we did not have enough trust, and we in the past, since another key is held in the hands of DPRK, which is beyond our control, will not be easy to resolve the situation, but we should do our utmost. So going on to my conclusion, like I said, unification through force or absorbing North Korea into unification is not possible. So it is important that we pursue mutual prosperity through parallel of reconciliation and cooperation with the North Korean nuclear issue resolution. So although a peaceful unification is not something that we can achieve overnight, it should be our ultimate goal, and based on the spirit of the basic agreement, we should focus our efforts on resolving internal conflicts conflicts and also conflict with North Korea and hostility. Of course, the 1991 Basic Agreement was agreed by North Korea due to their threats in their maintaining their regime. However, on the Korean Peninsula, which has faced conflict and hostility and distrust, the Basic Agreement can open up new doors for a new era, and I believe that it is very meaningful, and it led to a lot of discussions on unification, and at the time there was aspirations for unification on the Korean Peninsula. And with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you. So you have also spent 5 additional minutes, and during you had to cover 30 years of history, and due to that, I think many people, both of you had to use up more time due to time constraint. We will go immediately on to the discussion. I would like to bring up Jong Yeol-ryu first.
Yes, we'll be brief to stay on time, so I might rush through my commentary. Anyways, thank you very much, Professor Park Kwang-ho and Director Im Byung-chul for the presentations. Especially, the two of you talked about the inter-Korean relations and also the unification theory, and you have dedicated your whole life in studying those two topics. So I think that your presentations really resonated with all of us. And I mostly agree with what you said, and I would like to say thank you. The two of you talked about the background behind the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement and the way forward in implementing the agreement. So you analyzed the basic agreement, and you also talked about the implementation of the agreement. And the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement actually shows the different characteristics of the two Koreas in writing. And as we seek for reunification and better relations, the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement sets forth the overall framework that defines the relationship between the two Koreas. So the June 15th joint declaration and Roh Moo-hyun's October 14th agreement and Moon Jae-in's Panmunjom agreement actually has its basis on the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement. It begins with the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement. And of course, the road ahead is bumpy, but I'm sure that we will stay resilient, and the basic agreement will stay alive in that process. Of course, there are some areas of improvement, but it still is a very valuable outcome of the inter-Korean relations. The problem lies in the implementation of the basic agreement. Now, the agreement is historically significant, and of course it's a complete agreement, and it lays out details about what the two Koreas must do, but still it is not free from limitations. And this implementation is something that we need to look at very closely. The two Koreas actually had to get together to implement the basic agreement, but the North pulled out and refused to continue on with the implementation. So I believe that is why Professor Park talked much about the implementation of the agreement. So as I said, I mostly agree with what you said, but I would like to give a few comments to provide my perspective. And actually, Director Im talked about the effectiveness of as a treaty, and I think that we need to be be a little bit careful about that because there are many times for the international community to adopt treaties. But Professor Lee Geun-kwan of SNU said that adopting international documents should be done in a careful manner. The counterparts actually should do so when they cannot negotiate on an international stage and when they are in disagreement. And number 3, when change is too rapid and when the counterparts for negotiations do not have mutual trust. And those are the conditions that give rise to uncertainty. And then tentative agreements will be made so that they can minimize any legal accountability and avoid such accountability. And when it comes to the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement, the two representatives from the two sides actually showed a strong commitment to the agreement, but not much tangible results have been made. The Ministry of Unification failed to follow through on with the agreement, and actually the Supreme Court actually ruled against the agreement, and we can actually assume why that is the case. Now, moving on to the problem between the two Koreas that Director Im said, it's the chronic mistrust between the two Koreas, and this gives us some food for thoughts. Not because Director Im said that, but one of the questions that I've had so far is that the idea of mistrust between the two Koreas and how much impact it has on our future and relations. In other words, there are so many variables at play that influence and affect the inter-Korean relations. Then maybe this is a selective mistrust that we have towards each other. What I mean by that is the content of the basic agreement itself. Going back to the mistrust, yes, there is mistrust between the two Koreas, but there are some factors that have to come into play to resolve that. However, we have to closely examine the role of mistrust between the two Koreas and whether that is legitimate. So maybe we can take a different perspective in assessing the mistrust between the two Koreas. So does it violate any policies between the two Koreas, or what exactly does it do in the relations between the two Koreas? And then Professor Park talked about what we need to do to implement the agreement and talked about the long-lived provisions. And I believe that in the long term, this is actually something that we can rely on to improve the inter-Korean relations. In other words, it has to be sustainable and it has to be possible. So we have to do and start with things that are feasible for now. Of course, this is the most realistic approach that we can take given our past history. However, if it goes wrong, then it can just end up as a one-time measure and be used politically. So it has some limitations. So at the end of the day, it will not do do much benefit to much good to the inter-Korean relations. So that is a question that I would like to raise. And given the current circumstances, maybe it's better to base our action on strong deterrence. So depending on the behaviors of North Korea and how much they change, then we can shift our approach and control the inter-Korean relations. And also Director Im talked about very significant ideas. So whenever power changes, the policy on North Korea keeps changing. That leads to inconsistent policies, and it can actually harm inter-Korean relations, which gives us all the reason to develop consistent policies and maintain consistent policy towards North Korea. And that seems key to me. And this may look like a paradox, but it may be one of the only ways to maintain the inter-Korean relations alive. So that was my brief commentary on the two presenters. But I believe that your presentations were well-grounded, and we should actually learn from what you presented in developing our plans forward. Thank you very much, presenters, for your presentation, and thank you very much, the audience, for your time. Thank you.
Next, we will be hearing from Ung-hee Kim. Hello, I am Ung-hee Kim, the second discussant, and I prepared this discussion from three aspects. First, on the basic agreement. Second, on the ratification of the National Assembly, and third, on implementation of the basic agreement. The other discussants covered some parts, and I don't have a lot of time, so I would like to provide you with my opinion on the content of the basic agreement. So the basic agreement has a preamble and 4 parts. It discusses economy, social aspects, and cultural aspects, and also the forces and security. Like the other presenter said, it is close to a complete and a very perfect agreement. So the content of the basic agreement is very sophisticated. However, if I were trying to aim higher, in some areas, there are limitations and room for improvement. First, on the passage agreement. So, if you look at provision 7 of the East and West German Agreement, it includes sports and economy and culture. It also ensures the passage of the people between the border. And through this agreement, East and West Germans could go to the other side based on this institution. However, our basic agreement does not deal with such passage rights. During the high-level discussions that led up to the basic agreement, in South Korea's side put in a lot of effort to put into writing the ensurement of passage rights. We tried to persuade North Korea to allow the people of two sides to go to each other's country. But North Korea did not agree to this, and we could not put this in the agreement. If we had put into writing the passage rights in the basic agreement, then this would have enabled more human exchanges between North and South. Second, on the permanent offices of the two sides. If you look at the basic agreement of Germany, they said that they would have a permanent office established on the opposite side, and such permanent representative office was not included in our basic agreement. In the high-level discussion, we said that we wanted to establish a permanent liaison office or a representative office, but the North Korea said that it is based on the two Joseon philosophy. Therefore, they refused this idea. And if we had come to an agreement of this permanent office, then we could have had a permanent representative office of the two sides in Pyeongchang and Seoul. The marine borders, the borders for the West Sea was not determined in the armistice agreement. And 1 month after the armistice agreement, Mark Clark, the commander of the UN forces, made a proposal for patrolling, and this led to the NLL. In the provision 12 of the basic agreement, and according to the next agreements, the non-aggression for the marine demarcation line, they said that they would just discuss further, and we did not clear out this issue. Of course, such borders and boundaries and such lines, it's a very sensitive issue. Therefore, it is not an easy task to deal with. But in making such discussions for the basic agreement, it was a bit of an unfortunate thing that we could not deal with this matter more thoroughly because it was not included in the armistice agreement for the West Sea. If we had a clear line that divided the West Sea, then the basic agreement would have been more complete. And with this, I would like to end my discussion. Thank you for keeping to the time. Next, we will hear from the Standing Auditor of Kaesong Industrial District Foundation, Lee Mu-yeol.
Yes. So I would like to talk about the implementation of the basic agreement. I think that that should be our focus, and with that in mind, I would like to begin my commentary. So as we can see from the stance and behaviors of North Korea, no matter how great the agreement is and how monument the agreement is, then it is pointless that we have this agreement as North Korea refuses to abide by the agreement, and I'm sure that you will agree with me. And as the moderator, as well as other presenters said, we adopted the agreement and the annex agreement, and in the implementation phase, we were able to achieve this framework for the agreement. However, it is a shame that we were not able to, fulfill the agreement to the utmost. And of course, given the reality, it is challenging to keep the agreement intact and alive. However, we at least need to have some framework that can enable us to follow the agreement. So that would be one limitation that we need to examine. And I would like to talk about the ratification at the National Assembly and the implementation of the agreement? Well, first of all, when it comes to the ratification by the National Assembly, a few speakers and panelists shared their opinions, and I think that we need to make it legally binding, and at the same time, since it is segmented, do we actually need the ratification of the National Assembly? Then this may look like two opposing ideas, but given that the implementation of the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement is important, I think it has some commonalities. So first of all, the National Assembly need to ratify this agreement, and we must listen carefully to what the National Assembly has to say. So if we take a look at the case of Germany, then the government and the National Assembly did not do their utmost in following the agreement, and the same goes for Korea. So it's been almost 30 years. It's been 30 years since the adoption of the agreement, signing of the agreement. However, do we actually really need to ratify this agreement by the National Assembly? We need to actually ask that question first. So first, maybe we need to strike an agreement that is legally binding, and if that's the case, then we must go through the ratification of the National Assembly to make it effective, because we need to reach a national consensus on our North Korea policy and to make it a legitimate policy. And in order to achieve that, we must make sure that we can promote a stable inter-Korean relations by making legally binding. Number two, about institutionalization of the inter-Korean policy. And we, of course, must to institutionalize the agreement so that we can implement it faithfully. So given the behavior of North Korea and the political landscape of the Korean Peninsula, we had to shift our policy every single time. And because of that, we were not able to follow the agreement full on. So we have to make sure that we implement the agreement and to carry on with the agreement. And in order to do so, we need a legally binding agreement, and we must be devoted to that mission. In other words, it should go beyond a basic agreement. We have to make improvements and revision of the agreement and improve the framework. In that sense, Moon's administration is actually pursuing the signing of the basic agreement between the two Koreas as one of its 100th key tasks. We must redefine our relationship with North Korea, and once we do that, and once we sign this, it will be ratified by the National Assembly, and it will go submitted to the UN to make it binding. And that's part of the plan as well. And the Ministry of Reunification is looking into the details for the plan, so I will not give you the details here today. But, well, tension is still very much rising between the two Koreas. However, I truly hope that the two Koreas will see better relations in the future and to really be given an opportunity to improve its relations. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much.
So, the presenters and discussants all said in one voice that in the form and the content, the basic agreement was complete. However, in the implementation side, there was room for improvement, that there should have been institutional mechanisms to have a driving force to implement the basic agreement. Then, how can we increase the implementation of the basic agreement.
국제법적 효력,
In order for the basic agreement to have the effect of a treaty, an international treaty.
득했어야 한다.
And for example, we could have made the agreement ratified in the National Assembly. And ways to give the basic agreement more force for implementation, the methods were suggested in different ways. Now let's hear briefly from the presenters. I will give them each 2 minutes.
먼저
We will first hear from
박 교수님
Dr. Park.
이 순서로 하죠. 토론해 주신 내용들에
Yes,
저는 전적으로
I totally agree with what the discussants said, and you also pointed out some areas that I was not aware of, so thank you very much for that.
아무래도 이 이행과 관련한
When it comes to implementation and the institutional framework to implement the basic agreement, I think it's an important topic, and I think that the discussants focused their commentaries on that as well. Well, agreement involves two parties, so two counterparts, the North and the South, and it takes more than one side to implement the agreement, so it is something that we need to think about.
우리 기본 합의서 경우에도
So, if you look at the agreement, we have Chairman Kim Il-sung,
말하자면 우리 식으로 보자면
who signed the agreement. So from our perspective, the ratification process was complete. However, they are failing to abide by the agreement.
개인과 개인이
So here
집을 사고 판다.
you have, for instance, two individuals that are selling and buying house, then they will sign a contract. And that is a legally binding document because we have our justice system that guarantees
그 합의를 누군가가
that. However,
그런 시스템이 없는 거죠.
the
남북뿐만이 아니라 국제사회라는
inter-Korean agreement has no such
국제사회에서
legally binding framework, and the same goes for international communities agreements. So let's say we had this non-aggression treaty between Russia and Germany, but that was not kept.
합의의 이행은 이게
So
서로의
the implementation of an agreement depends on the necessity of one counterpart. And for instance, if one side or the two sides were to be subject to sanctions from the international community by not abiding by such an agreement, then maybe the two would stay faithful to the agreement. So whether or not the National Assembly here in Korea ratifies the agreement is one topic for discussion, but how can we actually guarantee the implementation of the agreement? That should be what we need to focus on.
예. 뭐 사실 제가 발표를 한 것은 이 토론을 좀 활성화하기 위해서 제가 이제
Actually, my presentation was to
제가 말씀드린 게
raise questions for the discussion.
아닙니다. 오늘 이제 토론을 맡아주신 분들 주신 의견.
And I'm not saying that what I'm saying is all right, and I know that some of the discussants said some comments that go against what I presented, and I think that they are based on sturdy evidence. But international society, there is a logic of force. However, we need some values and causes as a last resort. We need to have the will, and we also need to have some of the reasoning behind implementation. For example, let's say the basic agreement, if it has national binding forces, and right now North Korea is not recognizing the basic agreement, but one day they may. And when the North and South sit together for discussion, the basic agreement can be used as an important model for a new agreement. Therefore, let's say, from our side, if the basic agreement, if we are not prepared to implement it, if we do not make any preparations, then that will be a tragedy for the Korean people. So, regardless of the nature or characteristics of the administration here in the South, for us to have the legal basis for implementing it, we need to legislate it. And for it to have an effect of a treaty, it states the special relation of North and South, and on the international stage, the two sides are being recognized as independent states, and the peace regime that is recognized in the basic agreement, we should not make the North Korean nuclear issue a hindrance in progress. And I think that for us to have this ratified within our country, they will be helpful in getting international support, especially if it has an effect of a treaty. And with that, I will end my remarks. Do any of the discussants have anything to add?
Yes, so I would like to add on what I said before. So I'm not opposing to what the speaker said, but I would like to give you an additional explanation of what I said. So, of course, it's not about the implementation of one side. Of course, receiving ratification and passing through the National Assembly is not just the work that should be done by South Korea only. Of course, I actually learned from the case of West and East Germany, and I envy them in a sense, because it was actually ratified back in 1971, and of course the circumstances were different and everything was different from Korea and Germany, so we cannot actually compare apple to apple. However, East and West Germany, when they actually ratified the agreement, they added this clause. So with ratification, this will go into effect. However, that phrase is not included in our agreement. It's about exchanging between the two Koreas, and this document will go into effect after 1 month. That is the only thing that is included in our agreement. So, depending on the landscape and circumstances, North Korea can change its position very easily. And it's been 30 years since we first signed the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement. And given our history with North Korea, I believe that we must come up with some mechanism and framework that can institutionalize and implement the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement. So Korea's National Assembly and North Korea's WPK should ratify the agreement on both sides so that this can go into effect.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much.
지금 온라인으로 질문 페이지에 올려주신 질문들을 가지고 토론을 좀 하셔야 됩니다.
And we will be continuing with our discussion based on the questions received online. And I see that there are not any additional questions.
제가 좀 말씀을 하나 드리겠습니다.
Will Lee, the auditor, asked a question, but nobody answered. So I would like to make a comment on that question, that there are some areas that were not sufficient enough in the basic agreement. There wasn't a written agreement on the passage rights. And at the time, the situation was quite complicated. So the situation was not sufficient for us to have a passage agreement. Instead, in social, economic, culture, and sports areas, we said that we would enable those in these areas to have a free exchange. And we put that in. So actually, South Korea insisted that we put this free exchange comment in it, and the annex agreements continued with that provision. So it was to be on par with the passage rights, and we wanted to use that as a foothold in trying to strike a passage agreement with the North. And the permanent representative office, that it would have been great if we had included it in the agreement. Of course, we tried to put it in. However, North Korea opposed this. At the time, we had 2 separate seats in the United Nations, yet they said that they could not recognize 2 Koreas. And they said that this went against their philosophy, and so they insisted that it could be included in the next round of, for example, discussions. And as a compromise, they said that we can have a Panmunjom liaison office, and it would be quite big. So at the time, using all of the cards that we could use, we tried to lead the negotiations into a success. And these provisions were the success that we could get at the time. And the non-aggression line in the sea, it was something that was not even included in the armistice agreement. So we said we will continue on with this discussion. But there were certain jurisdictions and the lines that were being, so to say, maintained, and we could only recognize this. So the reality was just reflected into the agreement. And this gave some legitimacy to the military side, and I'm sure that there were conflicts internally in the North too. And so we tried to give some justification or legitimacy to the military side, but we wanted to once again restate the importance of the armistice agreement. So we were at an advantage there too, and I think that is the more appropriate evaluation of the basic agreement. I know that many are interested in implementation, and when we have other agreements between the 2 Koreas, it's not just about signing an agreement, it should be about implementation. And we had a lot of discussion on the issue of implementation, and one discussant already mentioned who is responsible for the non-implementation, who nullified the agreement. It is something that we should consider. Who is responsible for the non-implementation? When signing the basic agreement, North Korea was in a situation where the communist side was crumbling and the Soviet Union was normalizing its relations with South Korea, and their economy was on the brink of collapsing. So they were in a very critical situation, and what they wanted to gain from South Korea was a non-aggression agreement. That was the position and intent of North Korea at the time. That is why in the 4 provisions of the basic agreement, for example, the first one, recognizing each other's regime, and that there should be non-interference of internal matters, and that there should not be criticism of each other, and aggression. There should not be aggression. And it was North Korea trying to protect their regime from
된다는 의미거든요.
South Korea. They wanted to maintain their regime. And in order to gain this, they considered this a non-aggression declaration, and that's why they put a lot of effort in it. And that night, those who participated in the negotiations was hugged by Kim Jong-un and so forth. Kim Jong-il. Then North Korea. Why did they break this agreement then? Why did they walk away from the agreement? Why didn't they implement the agreement? We should think about this carefully.
당시에 92년도 팀 스피릿 훈련은
The 92 Team Spirit exercise was not done due to the basic agreement, but the 1993 Team Spirit exercise was carried out. So for North Korea, it seemed that to them that South Korea and the United States had no intention and will to implement the basic agreement. And they felt that they were being pressured, that South Korea is trying to absorb them. That's why they might have decided to discard the agreement. So North Korea had this strategic goal, but South Korea and the United States did not accept this. Therefore, unlike their initial intent of trying to achieve peaceful coexistence, they decided to walk away from it. Some analyze the situation like that. But on the other side, some think that North Korea did not have any intention to implement the basic agreement from the beginning. They just wanted to create a better environment or atmosphere on the Korean Peninsula to approach Japan and the United States to realize their ultimate goal of developing nuclear weapons, and that this was just a cover-up for them to develop their nuclear weapons behind the scenes. And that's why they were just using the Team Spirit military exercise as an excuse to walk away from the agreement. So there are these two opposing opinions, and depending on which side we put more weight on, it will change where the focus will be on bringing North Korea back. Depending on how we analyze the reason behind North Korea's departure, we will have to find new ways. So it is important for us to have an accurate diagnosis. So on enhancing the ability of implementing this basic agreement, I think there needs to be more in-depth review. Actually, if we comb through the reasons from the mid-80s, we started to see improvement in our economy, and during the 1988 Seoul Olympic Games, South Korea felt that we had an upper hand compared to North Korea. But the Korean War and the provocations of the North and the experience of the terror activities and Korean War, it led to a trauma to the South Korean side, and we wanted to prevent North Korea from its provocative activities. We wanted to break away from the fear of North Korea. North Korea, we hoped that they would abandon their goal of making the entire Korean Peninsula a communist peninsula. So, from our side too, we wanted mutual recognition of the two regimes, and we wanted an insurance and a guarantee that there should be non-interference and non-criticism and non-aggression. So there was this alignment of the interest of two sides, which led to the agreement.
그래서 기본 합의서가 이행되지 못한
So on the reasons behind the non-implementation, we need to look at the actual reasons and find the root causes more thoroughly so that we can have a more healthy inter-Korean relation which is sustainable and which has the capabilities to improve and move forward. And I think we have used up our time. Are there any questions from the floor? If there are any questions, I understand that they have to be asked via online. There is one question that we have received. The basic agreement, will it be remodeled to have another inter-Korean agreement? There's the denuclearization issue of the Korean Peninsula, and this has to be included in. Does it have to be included in a new basic treaty or agreement?
So I will briefly talk about that. Yes, as I said, the details for the agreement, that project is led by the Ministry of Unification and the government, so I do not know all the details, but I have been involved in that project from the beginning of the administration. So if the agreement was to be signed, I believe that it will go beyond the existing agreement. So we could call the existing agreement 1.0 version and the new one 2.0. And this is my personal take on the agreement, but once we sign it, well, it's been 30 years since the signing of the first inter-Korean basic agreement, and everything has changed, including the landscape, the circumstances, and the nuclear issues from North Korea. And we have to stay faithful to the spirit and the objective of the inter-Korean relations. So that should be the premise. However, of course, we have some people here who were involved in the project for the first inter-Korean basic agreement. It's a very tiring road. It's not an easy road to take, and the road ahead of us will be bumpy, and it will require much time. And the Ministry of Reunification, when it first laid out this task, it wasn't 100% sure how long this process would take. So I believe that it will collect the opinion of the public and to make some improvement of its plan to make the 2.0 agreement very solid. Thank you very much for that. And what about the East-West Germany's basic agreement? So in terms of content, was it very different from the one in Korea? Well, I can't compare apple to apple, as I said. But, if you look at the treaty of West and East Germany, it's only 10 provisions, but we have 15 annex and provisional agreement. So you have the general agreement and you have the annex for each chapter. So the layout is the same. However, I focused on the way it went into effect. So for us, the two sides, of course, the moment the document is exchanged, then this document will go into effect. However, as I said, the timing of when the agreement goes into effect is stipulated in the German's case. Now, of course, it's a basic treaty, but at the international level, it's a relationship exchange between two countries. However, it is a special relationship because it's an internal issue between the two Germanys. And I was happy to see that we had that laid out in the Korean version of the agreement as well. And of course, it's a national matter, and we are in a special relationship. But since we are a member of the UN, then we have to have a dual track, both internally and externally. Yes, thank you very much for that.
So, our session is to end at 3. So with this, we will end our session. So it's been 30 years, and still we are discussing the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement, and we still talk about the significance of the spirit of the Basic Agreement and the completeness of it. So I think it is still a precious agreement, and it should be shared, and it still can be a reference in the inter-Korean relations. And I hope that we can successfully hand down the spirit of the Basic Agreement so that the inter-Korean relations can be healthier in the future. With this, I will conclude the session. Thank you.